begin. As promised last time, we're doing Carolyn West's personal identity conceptual analysis and no fault disagreement. The personal identity debate seems to have reached an impasse. There appear to be at least two different families of candidate meanings for a person talk corresponding to each of the main theories of personal identity, and it does not seem that either way of speaking is demonstrably mistaken or irrational or in clear violation of a firm a priori constraints governing use of the term person and its cognates. This threatens to make debate over the nature of personal identity look merely semantic, simply a dispute about how everyone should use the words. Yet this is very hard to believe. Making progress requires showing how what is at issue is What is at issue in the debate is more than merely terminological. I offer some suggestions as to where progress may lie. For more than a century, the personal identity debate has been dominated by a battle between various theories, typically presented as rivals and mutually exclusive conceptual analyses. According to the psychological continuity theory, X at earlier time t and Y at later time t prime are stages of the same person if and only if they stand to each other in certain psychological relations, such as those of memory, projects, values, and character. Prominent defenders of psychological continuity theory include Lewis, Noonan, Parfit, Perry, Robain, and Shoemaker. These look like endnotes, but they're citations, so we're fine. According to the bodily continuity theory, X at t and Y at t prime are stages of the same person if and only if Y stands to X in certain bodily relations. For example, if and only if Y has the same functioning brain and or body as X, or if and only if X and Y are stages of the same human animal B. While the duel between, and these are Wiggins, Williams, Thompson, Olson, Snowden, Van Vagen. While the duel between bodily and psychological continuity theories has dominated the contemporary debate, it's important to note that there are also significant in-house disagreements within each of these broad camps as to precisely which of the various kinds of psychological or bodily relations are most central, or it follows they'll speak of being a persisting body person and being a persisting psychological person as if they were two different candidate conceptions of personal identity, but given the internal disputes within each of the bodily and psychological continuity camps over exactly which kinds of bodily or psychological relations are most central, it should be noted that this is a gross oversimplification for the sake of convenience. In fact, there are many different versions of each of these theories, and so there are not two but many different candidate conceptions of being persisting body persons and being a persistent psychological person corresponding to each of these versions. This is worth noting since it suggests that reaching a consensus in favor of one or the other of these general approaches would still not be sufficient to sell the debate. We would still need to resolve the further in-house debates about precisely which version of the winning general approach is correct. For further discussion, see reference 13. Couldn't hurt to take a look at what 13 is. Robinson. Well, that's something I put on my to-read list yesterday. In addition, various mixed or hybrid theories have been proposed. See, for example, 14 and 15. Nagel and Unger, yes. Mixed theories hold that bodily and psychological continuity are necessary and generally sufficient for a person's continued existence over time. There are other views that do not fall into any of these three camps, so it's largely fallen out of favor. In contemporary naturalistic inclined philosophers, some philosophers continue to defend the soul view, according to which different stages of the same person, if and only if they have the same numerically identical immaterial soul. There are also theorists who reject all such attempts to analyze personal identity, holding instead that personal identity is simple and unanalyzable. These are usually soul people, I suspect. Oh, it's Madeline Merrick's. I think I read this. How do we decide which of any of these theories is the right one? Ever since Locke, the dominant method has been to test the various theories against our intuitive judgments, cases in which the theories deliver different verdicts. These include actual cases involving amnesia, brainwashing, brain death, permanent coma, and the like, and also possible cases such as brain transplants, brain state transfers, and teleportation. The correct analysis, it's generally supposed, is the one that best predicts and explains our considered judgments about who is who across a range of these cases. Notoriously, however, people's intuitive responses to these cases tend to vary considerably, and after more than a century of pumping intuitions regarding many and varied such puzzle cases, we still seem no closer to reaching a consensus in favor of one of the theories that have been proposed. The personal identity debate seems to have reached an impasse. My main aim in this paper is to shed light on the nature and roots of this impasse and suggest what needs to be done if we are to make progress. The outline of the paper is as follows. In section 2, I suggest that soul theorists are right to think that the persisting, strictly identical immaterial soul, if it existed, would be the best candidate for personal identity in the sense of according most closely with our ordinary conception of who persons are. or what persons are. By best candidate, I mean the best deserver of the label person. This has to be discussed in section 2. A best deserver theory is a meta-theory about what type of object best satisfies our ordinary conception of persons. It should be distinguished from what is sometimes called the best candidate view, which is not a meta-theory, but rather a substantive object level account of what personal identity consists in. Sadly, however, our science tells us that souls do not actually exist, so soul theorists are mistaken to think that personal identity over time, in fact, consists in persisting immaterial soul. The upshot is that it turns out that the best candidate for personal identity does not exist. This raises the disturbing specter of an error regarding the error theory regarding persons in section 3 and 4. I argue that the error theory can only be avoided if one of the remaining candidates that are instantiated, most obviously being a bodily continuer or else being a psychological continuer or both, is a good enough candidate for personal identity over time, and clearly better than any of the other existing candidates. However, the trouble is that it's not obvious that any of the other candidates is clearly the second best, as the entrenched and seemingly irresolvable disagreement that characterizes the personal identity debate testifies. It appears that some people use person and its cognates to refer to bodily continuance, while others use the words to refer to psychological continuance. It doesn't seem that either way of speaking is obviously mistaken. This threatens to make the dispute over whether persons are human animals or else psychological beings look merely semantic, simply a disagreement about how everyone should use the words person, I, and proper names. I focus on the word person as the one word that comes closest to expressing the concept that concerns us here, but the linkage here noted between the person, I, and the proper names reveals that the underlying concept cannot simply be identified with the meaning of a single word. It's the concept we are fundamentally interested in, not the words. In what follows, I use the word person as a philosophical term of art stipulated to express the concept person. Yet this is very hard to believe. Making progress in a personal identity debate requires showing how the debate is more than merely semantic. This is a difficult task. I conclude in section 6 with some suggestions about where progress might lie. We think of a conception or folk theory of some subject matter X as made up of a cluster of reasonably widespread and relatively entrenched beliefs about X. Here in what follows, I am indebted to the general approach to conceptual analysis defended in reference 21, probably Rawls? No, Jackson. In cases of personal identity, these include beliefs such as the following. Normally, if someone looks exactly the same as another person, they are the same person. Usually, if someone has the same body as another person, they are the same person as the earlier person. Normally, if someone has the same brain as the earlier person, they're the same person as the earlier person. Normally, if someone has the same fingerprints as the earlier person, they're the same person. Normally, if someone remembers doing something in the past, they are the same person as the person who did it. Normally, when a person acts freely, he or she is acting on her own previously formed intentions and not on someone else's. Normally, if someone has the same values and characters as an earlier person, then they are the same person. There are also beliefs about the connections between the concepts of personal identity and the range of other practical and ethical concepts. For instance, the following statements seem to express conceptual truths. It is fair to hold a person morally and legally accountable for a past action only when they are the same person who did the action. While I can wish that other people had acted differently in the past, I can only regret my past actions. If someone else would be in pain, I can empathize with them, but I should fear only those painful events that happen to me. Only if someone is the same person as your spouse, it is appropriate to treat them as your spouse. Usually, someone is entitled to a particular piece of property only when they are the same person as the person who bought it. Collectively, these and other of our common sense beliefs regarding persons form our ordinary conception of personal identity. To the extent that these beliefs are shared, they constitute our common conception or folk theory of personal identity. However, not all our common sense beliefs about persons are equally central to our conception. For instance, it's part of the conception that persons have legs and that they can walk, but these beliefs are not especially central to our conception of what persons are. This reveals our judgment about certain cases, in particular by the fact that we are willing to allow that a mute or legless person can still be a person, provided other conditions are satisfied. Did I say walk up here? This is talk. If by contrast we were not willing to allow that a legless person could be a person, this would suggest that we employed a slightly different conception of persons. Person star, in which the property of having legs occupied an extremely central place. Judgments about actual and possible cases reveal our ordinary conception of persons and of being the same person over time by revealing what possibilities we're disposed to rule in and what we're disposed to rule out as falling under the extension of person and of same person. There will also be properties that do not even get to count as candidates for personal identity in virtue of failing to satisfy enough of our ordinary conception. The property of the persons having the same number of atoms in the left big toenail as the earlier person is perhaps an example. It's also worth noting that not all our common sense beliefs about persons are held with equal confidence. Speaking for myself, I'm much more confident in the correctness of my belief that I have a reason to fear my own future pain than in my belief that a future person will be me if they have my body. One important point to glean from this preliminary discussion is that whether something satisfies our ordinary conception of something need not be an all or nothing affair. A perfect deserver for our conception of personal identity would be a property or relation among person stages, that is, how persons are at various times. It squares with all our beliefs about personal identity, or at least with all the relatively central ones. in the absence of such a perfect candidate, various candidates may be better or worse suited to falling under a concept, depending on the degree to which they satisfy greater or fewer of the beliefs about personal identity that we hold most dear. The best deserver of our ordinary conception of personal identity, or the labels person, same person, will be the kind of thing that satisfies a weighted most of our common sense beliefs. I don't know what this, I mean, I get what she's saying, but something happened with this sentence. The traditional, a weighted, the traditional quest for an answer to this question of personal identity can be seen as the search to discover what this best deserver is. I'm very yawny. Of the different candidates for personal identity picked up by the various theories of personal identity, which is best placed to fall under ordinary conception. Obviously, a stock take of common intuition reactions to actual cases and to actual and possible cases reveal that our ordinary conception of personal identity is Cartesian in character. For the hypothesis that seems to best explain many people's pre-analytic intuitions to cases is the view that persons are essentially immaterial souls for which the various observable bodily and psychological properties and relations are normally reliable but fallible evidence. While I cannot undertake a full survey of our intuitions regarding cases here, discussion of a few such cases should be sufficient to make a prima facie case for this claim. Some of the most striking evidence is provided by the widespread intuitive responses to the two famous cases due to Bernard Williams. Williams first asks us to imagine a case in which two persons, A or B, are to undergo a procedure in which a machine gradually transfers A's psychological life to B's body, while B's mental life is in turn transferred to A's body. We are told after the procedure is complete, one of the resulting persons will be tortured, while the other will get a large financial reward. While we are to imagine that we are the A body person about to undergo the procedure, while we cannot alter the fact that someone after the procedure will be tortured, we can choose which the A body and the B body person after the procedure receives the torture and which receives the reward. We are to make this choice on purely self-interested grounds. The dominant reaction to this case is that if we're the A body person before the procedure, we choose the A body person after the procedure to get the torture, and that the B body person gets the reward. On the natural assumption that a self-interested person would choose so as to avoid their being tortured in the future, this intuition seems to support psychological continuity theory. It suggests that we believe A would be the B body person after the procedure, and so we think that a person goes where their distinctive psychology goes. Memories, intuitions, values, projects, the character, and so forth goes, and not where their body goes in cases where these relations come apart. Williams then asks us to consider the following case. You're told that you'll be tortured tomorrow. There is nothing you can do to avoid the torture, but you're offered the following constellations. First, you'll lose your memories, then you'll be given a set of new memory impressions. Following this, you'll acquire a whole new set of different character traits that happens resemble those previously associated with a different body. None of these changes, Williams thinks, will come as any relief. They make no difference to the fear you feel at prospect of the impending torture. On the reasonable assumption that you fear future pain only when you believe it will happen to you, this suggests that you think that the person who will be tortured will be you, despite the complete lack of psychological continuity between you and that future person. Williams takes this to support the bodily continuity theory, for it suggests that you think that the person with your body will be you, despite the absence of psychological continuity. But as Williams notes, there's something very puzzling about our intuitive responses here. For the second case, it's just the same case as the first, it's simply described differently. We therefore seem to have contradictory intuitions about the same case, tracking personal identity with psychological continuity, not bodily continuity in the first case, and tracking it with bodily continuity, not psychological continuity in the second. Taken together, our intuitive judgments about these cases seem to reveal that we take neither bodily continuity nor psychological continuity to be either necessary or sufficient for personal identity. The combination of these intuitions cannot readily be explained by either bodily or the psychological continuity theory. Although see reference 22 for an alternative. Nozick. I don't remember what Nozick says. They seem to make sense only on the supposition that we take a person to be a featureless soul pellet, a bare locus of mental life, an entity that continue to exist despite any amount of bodily and psychological discontinuity. Who talks about soul pellets? Mark Johnson. The hypothesis that we implicitly take ourselves to be soul pellets explains other features of our ordinary practice that would otherwise be puzzling, such as the widespread tendency to find coherent tales of reincarnation without accompanying bodily or psychological continuities. Error theory or conceptual revision? If this is right, we face a difficult choice. A pre-theoretical conception of personal identity presupposes the existence of persisting immaterial things, but our best science tells us there are in fact no such things. Moreover, as Locke noted, critical reflection on various possible cases in which the soul comes apart from the body and psychological continuity seems to reveal that a featureless soul, even if it existed, would not be worth caring about in the way in which we ordinarily care about personal identity. So, Descriptive conceptual analysis combined with certain a posteriori information about the way the world actually is reveals that the best candidate for personal identity doesn't exist. There exists nothing that fully answers to our current conception of what persons are and how they persist. Nothing that is quite what would pre-analytically take personal identity to be. How should we respond? There seem to be two options. The first would be to accept an error theory of persons, holding that while we pre-analytically believe that persons exist and persist, inform critical reflection on the commitments implicit in our ordinary conception of what persons are reveal that there is nothing that answers our conception closely enough, and so these beliefs are in fact uniformly false. Alternatively, we might look to see if there's a nearby conception that is instantiated and satisfies enough of the things we currently take to be true about persons, and so as to deserve to count as a conception of personal identity, and then adopt it as our preferred conception. On occasions, we are willing to accept an error theory of some subject matter. For instance, at some point in our lives, most of us come to accept an error theory regarding Santa Claus. We become error theorists about Santa. And then we come to think we are mistaken to believe that there is in fact exists a jolly red-suited man who lives with the elves of the North Pole and flies to the sky once a year on a sled pulled by reindeers to deliver presents to children who have been good. The discovery that there is no man who has enough of the properties we associate with Santa leads us to conclude that Santa doesn't exist. Note that we come to be error theorists about Santa despite the fact that there is in fact someone who has some of the properties we associate with Santa, such as leaving presents from Santa and the Korea on Christmas Eve, naming our parents. But when we catch our parents and not a jolly red-suited man depositing presents from Santa under the Christmas tree on Christmas Eve, we do not generally revise our views about Santa's nature and conclude that Santa is our parents. Rather, we conclude that Santa doesn't exist. Yeah, in the Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus, accepted, of course. What our response here reveals is that our parents are not sufficiently good deservers for the label Santa. They do not satisfy enough for our ordinary conception of what Santa is to deserve to fall under the concept. Another example, some people become error theorists of God when they come to believe that there in fact exists no omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient person who created the world. Neither of these discoveries are entirely without cost. The discovery that Santa does not exist can be greatly distressing, and giving up belief in God yet more so. But however difficult it is to live without Santa or God, it would be considerably more difficult to live without persons. Personal identity plays an absolutely central role in our everyday lives. Giving up on the belief that persons exist and persist through time would force changes to our existing ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving on a scale that's difficult fully to imagine. Prudential concern, friendship, and loving relations, descriptions of moral and legal responsibility, and attributions of property entitlement are but a few of the many emotions and practices that would need to be abandoned or ready to revise should we give up believing that persons exist and persist over time. While some seem prepared to toy with accepting an error theory of persons, it seems to me that because of the considerable cost, there should be an option of last resort, to be accepted only if all of the nearby candidate conceptions, bodily continuers, psychological continuers alike, are patently undeserving of the label persons. Some place Jackson, for instance, seems to endorse the view. We have then considerable incentives to look to see whether if any of the actually available candidates is the second or third best, whatever, blah, blah, blah. We're just going to real quickly note that West doesn't like no self-views. I wonder if, strictly speaking, that should go in as an argument against these kind of views. Let's just check this Jackson citation. Yeah. You can hear my cat destroying the couch, I think. Unfortunately, however, once we eliminate the soul from contention, none of the obviously remaining candidate conceptions, the conceptions corresponding to the various theories of personal identity that have been proposed, for example, human, animal, or bodily continuer, psychological continuer, and the like, seems uncontroversially to stand out from all the others is clearly best. This is what I think we learned from the intentional ongoing disagreement over whether bodily continuity or psychological continuity or some or other conjunction or disjunction of these provides the correct analysis of personal identity over time. One striking feature of the personal identity debate is that it's not unusual to find that people who agree about the non-personal facts of a case nonetheless continue systematically to disagree about whether or not the case is one in which personal identity is preserved. Consider, for instance, the much discussed possible case of Star Trek-style teleportation, in which a person's original matter is destroyed while a machine constructs an exact duplicate from the new matter at another location from a blueprint taken of the original. The person who emerges from the booth has all the psychology of the original person's memories, intentions, values, and so forth, but realizes that in the new body, that is qualitatively indistinguishable from the original. When presented with this case, some judge that a person determined it could not survive such a procedure, while others are equally firmly conceive that the teleportation will constitute a perfectly fine way for a person to travel. The former judgment is taken to be evidence in favor of bodily continuity theory, while the latter judgment is supposed to support a psychological continuity theory. It's worth noting that this kind of disagreement is not confined merely in possible cases, but arises equally when people consider certain actual cases in which bodily and psychological continuities come apart. Does a person's life history include fetal stages? Can a person continue to exist in a permanent vegetative state? People's opinions about whether it's correct to say that there's a continuing person in these cases differ, as the continuing debates surrounding abortion and euthanasia testify. Of course, people's intuitive judgments about a case may sometimes be less than fully reliable guide to their concept. For instance, if there's evidence that subjects on one side of the debate were confused or hadn't understood the details of the case properly, or if their judgments about a case contradicted their judgments about other relevantly similar cases, we would be justified in discounting their judgments about this case as unreliable. While it's clearly sometimes right to discount a person's judgments case on these grounds, it's implausible to suppose that all differences in opinion in the personal identity debate can be resolved by pointing to one of the disputing parties as uniformly demonstrably confused, irrational, or linguistically incompetent. This is especially so given that there seem to be no non-question-begging ways of identifying the mistake that one or the other side is making. For example, many bodily continuity theorists claim that the intuition that a person survives teleportation can be explained away by the presence of misleading features in how the case is usually presented. For instance, that the process is typically described as teletransportation, which primes subjects to view it as a form of travel, not suicide, or that's the product of subjects confusing the intuition that teleportation preserves its practical significance in personal identity with a judgment that preserves personal identity. Purged of these confounding factors, it's often suggested to be clear that our intuitions in fact go along with bodily criterion. See, for instance, 10, 15, 24. Wonder if one of those is wholesome. 10 is wholesome, 15 is Unger, and 24 is Shekman. But psychological continuity theorists might do equally apply this strategy to explain away the contrary intuition that a person does not survive teletransportation. For instance, they may claim that those who have the intuition of failing properly to distinguish between personal identity, which is preserved in teletransportation, and animal identity, which is not. Once people grasp this distinction properly, it might be suggested they will converge on the view that persons are essentially psychological beings, which typically coincide with particular human animals in everyday life, or which need not do so. But of course, whether the case is misdescribed or whether failure to distinguish between persons and animals is evidence of conceptual confusion rather than clear-headed thinking are precisely the kinds of questions that appeal to intuitions is supposed to help settle, and so it's not something to which either side can appeal in advance. Apparently informed, linguistically competent, and otherwise seemingly rational people who have thought long and hard about a wide variety of cases generally seem to differ somewhat as to exactly what it takes for a person to persist. It's hard to see how these disagreements can be rationally resolved. Consider, for instance, the debate about whether an early-term fetus is a person. The majority of naturalistically inclined parties to this debate agree that the relevant non-person facts. They agree, for instance, that an early-term fetus is a human animal, one that lacks mental capacities and traits, consciousness, reasoning abilities, projects, and so forth, possessed by typical adult members of their species. Moreover, they generally agree that these facts are the only facts that are relevant to deciding question whether or not early-term fetus is a person. That what they seem to disagree about is the semantic question of whether a being with these properties is correctly called a person. Some say an early-term fetus is determinately not a human person, for it lacks the psychological properties central to personhood. Others say it determinately is a human person, for it's a human being. Neither side, it seems, can be faulted for being mistaken about the matter of non-personal fact. Another side seems in violation of a firm a priori constraints governing use of the term person. We do not generally find either way of speaking unintelligible or incoherent. If it were clear that there were a particular privileged natural kind to be associated with the term person, then we might be justified in viewing one way of speaking as correct and the other as deficient, but it's not obvious that this way of speaking better carves nature at the joints. For a detailed argument to this effect, see 25. I return to this issue briefly in section 6. If so, the debate over whether a fetus is a person is simply a terminological disagreement. A dispute about whether the term person is true of an early term fetus. Consider a different, more innocuous example. I once had a disagreement with a neighbor about whether Neil, the head chef at the local Thai restaurant, was a bachelor. I said he was. My neighbor disagreed, looking for an explanation for our differences. We proceeded to confirm that we had the same person in mind, that he was indeed an unmarried man, that he was in fact of marriageable age, and so on. Granting all this was so, my neighbor nonetheless insisted that Neil was not a bachelor simply since his apartment was always clean and he was a good cook. Your neighbor is deranged. This, in her opinion, meant that he could not be a bachelor. In this case, we discovered that our disagreement is merely terminological, for we agree about all the relevant facts described one way. What we disagree about is whether the term bachelor correctly applies to describe those facts. Although my apartment is not clean right now. The cats. By her lights, bachelors cannot be neat and good cooks, notwithstanding being male and unmarried, as I use the term they can. Our differing judgments about Neil's case reveal that we employ somewhat different conceptions of bachelor. There would be no point here arguing about which of us is right, unless she were to go on to claim that everyone uses the word bachelor to mean what she does, in which case she would be mistaken about that. Similarly, she might say that my judgments are governed by my conception of bachelor, while she employs a conception of bachelor star, which is different from but overlaps with mine, in the sense of delivering the same verdict about many but not all actual cases. One last example, this time closer to the subject at hand. People who argue about whether teleportation is person-preserving agree about non-personal facts of the case, that is, facts about what occurs to the brain, body, and psychology of the person who undergoes teleportation as it's described. If we have understood the case properly and we know that teleportation was produced by way of a reliable causal mechanism, a person who is in all physical and psychological respects indistinguishable from the original but constructed from new matter, suppose. Furthermore, we know that the process is regarded by the person's community and by the person themselves as a form of travel. Stephen White claims the facts about how a person or community view a process, and in particular whether or not they treat the resulting process as the same as the original, is relevant to determining whether or not they survive it. We need some spaces here. The person who emerges from the booth at the receiving end will be regarded as entitled to the property of the person who entered the booth prior to being teleported, held accountable for the actions and so forth. Therefore, any of the naturally acceptable accounts of the personal identity that have been seriously proposed, we know everything we need to know in order to decide the question of whether or not the person who emerges from the teleporter is the same person as the original. While I was doing this, number one, my cat has now made some noise, and number two, I'm thinking back to something yesterday. There's the discussion about person as a forensic term. I'm wondering whether I want just a list of everybody who says person is a forensic term to be in Hypernomical. Oh, look. I did it yesterday. Why did I not? Yeah, okay. So it's already in there. Good. One of my cats, I have a mat under the food bowls, and she likes to paw at the mat. I think because she likes to try to sort of cover the food bowls, because she does it to the water too. But it makes noise. What are you doing, kitty cat? Okay, you're back. They never come when I do that, but if on reflection some people then go on to say that teleportation is person preserving while others say that it's not, this suggests that there is some variation in how the term person is used by different subsections of the general population. Those who regard the statement a person survives teleportation as being determinately false are presumably using the term person to refer to a bodily continuum to a human animal. Their judgments about cases seem to be governed by the conception of persons as human animals or persons of body. Those who regard the claim that a person survives teleportation are obviously true, on the other hand, are using the term person to pick out psychological continuum. Their judgment about who's in the various cases seems to be governed by the conception of persons as psychological entities, that is, person psychological. These concepts deliver the same verdict about most everyday cases in which bodily and psychological continuities are present together. The variation emerges in the respective judgments about less common cases where bodily and psychological continuity come apart, though they differ as to what kind of entity person is true of. These concepts have something in common, in virtue of which it seems plausible to regard each as a person concept. Parties who disagree about whether it's true, what are you doing, kitty cat? Whether it's true to say that person survives teleportation, nonetheless agree about the connection between person identity and certain other evaluative and ethical concepts. They typically agree, for instance, that if a later person is the same person as an earlier person, then inter alia would be appropriate for the earlier person to extend prudential concern to the later person, and for the later person to be held accountable for the earlier person's actions, although two recent defenses of the bodily approach deny this. See Olson and somebody else, I think. To my mind, this raises the question of whether these analyses deserve to be thought of as analyses of personal identity rather than accounts of animal identity. See reference 27. That's what I read yesterday, right? Yes. What they differ about is what relational properties these practices track. Given that concepts play the same functional role in structuring the person-directed practical and ethical concerns of those who employ them, it may be more apt to say that the parties are employing different person sub-concepts rather than different concepts in particular. However, it's very hard to believe that dispute over whether a bodily or psychological criterion is correct is merely semantic. It's counterintuitive to think that the difference between whether I will survive some upcoming process or event depends on something as ostensibly trivial about how I or my community use the words. That objection to conventionalism is in here somewhere. Done. Suppose I'm wondering whether I will survive some upcoming event, teletransportation for instance. It's hard to believe whether or not I survive depends simply on whether I or my community uses person to refer to a human animal which does not survive this process, or to a psychological continuum which does. This one important difference between the case of bachelor and person. It seems comparatively untroubling to concede that the answer to the question of whether Neil is a bachelor depends on which of a number of closely related conceptions of bachelor we choose to employ. Not so in the case of personal identity. It seems to be part of our ordinary conception of personal identity that the difference between continuing to exist and ceasing to exist does not simply depend on what conceptual scheme we happen to employ or how we use words, but is a substantive matter that is settled independently of our conceptual or linguistic practices. We tend to think that's correct for me to call some future person me because that future person will be me, not the other way around. It therefore seems to be part of our ordinary conception of personal identity that there is a single clear best deserver for the label person. The very fact that there appear to be a number of different but equally good candidates for the label person itself thereby seems to undermine the deservingness of each of the available candidates. The absence of an obvious single best candidate for personal identity seems to push us back in the direction of an error theory of personal identity. Making progress in the personal identity debate requires showing how what is at issue is more than merely semantic. There seem to be to me three main ways in which this might be said to be so, and consequently that there are three main avenues along which I might help to make progress. The first concerns underlying questions about fundamental ontology. There are certain views about the nature of persistence that, if correct, would rule out the existence of multiple candidates for personal identity. Suppose there exists only one kind of persistent entity available to be associated with that person talk, it would then turn out that there is at most one correct use of the term person, namely the use that corresponds to the one candidate in fact available. For instance, defenders of bodily continuity theory might hold for general ontological reasons that only body persons exist while psychological continuums do not. In this case, there will be the psychological continuity theory is mistaken for much the same reason that the soul view is generally thought to be mistaken, i.e. because it relies on false views about what entities exist. Following Cider, call this view about the ontology of persistence chaste endurantism. If chaste endurantism is correct, then disagreement about personal identity will be more than merely semantic. There would be at most a single correct answer to the question of personal identity, the one that corresponds to the only actual existing candidates, even if we do not agree on what it was. However, the question of whether such a chaste ontology is correct is itself a hotly contested issue in analytic metaphysics. Others, including myself, accept a different four-dimensionalist account of the nature of persistence. For a comprehensive recent discussion and defense of four-dimensionalism, see reference 28. I'm not going to bother looking up that one. Yes, I am. Cider. On this view, persisting objects, including persons or collections or aggregates of numerically distinct time slices, or on unrestricted or rich versions of four-dimensionalism, there exist many such aggregates. In particular, there exists an aggregate that corresponds to the bodily continuity theory, and a different aggregate that corresponds to the psychological continuity theory, and aggregates that correspond to each of the various mixed theories. If rich four-dimensionalism is true, no account of personal identity can be dismissed as factually mistaken on the grounds that there is, in fact, no entity that corresponds to the theory. There will exist multiple candidates for being the meaning of person talk. From the perspective of rich four-dimensionalism, the question of personal identity equates to the semantic question of which the many existing space-time worms person refers to. This may seem to make the question of personal identity for personal identity for a four-dimensionalist merely a semantic one, also, for instance, makes this term. But this is not so. While rich four-dimensionalists admit that there are many candidates available for being the referent person, not all the candidates need to be equally good. If one candidate conception were in any way head and shoulders above the best, this would settle the question of personal identity in favor of that candidate. As I see it, there are two ways in which a particular candidate might clearly be the rest of the competition. It might be that one of the available candidate meanings is more intrinsically eligible to be meant than any of the other in virtue of carving nature at its joints. This is another way in which it might turn out the debate over persons is more than merely semantic for a persuasive argument where neither of the candidates better carves nature at its joints. See reference 25. There's another way in which the question of personal identity might be more than merely semantic. As previously noted, personal identity plays an absolutely central role in our psychological and social lives. Facts about personal identity underpin prudential concern, the distinctive anticipatory concern that we ordinarily have for our own future experiences, and connected emotions and motivations such as fear of future pain, and the desire to take action to avoid it. Attitudes to our past, such as a special kind of remorse that we feel for our own mistakes, moral agency, and descriptions of responsibility. I can only be held responsible for my past actions. Property entitlements, I own my car now because I'm the person who bought it. How we treat others, whether it's a colleague, a spouse, or a friend, or a stranger, and much else besides. Answers to this question of personality therefore have important practical and moral consequences for whose action we can be held accountable for whose future experiences, if any, we can look forward to having and plan for, how we should feel about someone's past actions and experiences, and for how we should treat and be treated by others. Determining whether or not a process is one that person can survive, therefore plausibly involves more than merely deciding how to use words, but is bound up with a range of central practical concerns. Whether it's true to say that a person survives teleportation is not then simply a decision about how to use the word person or which of a number of available person concepts to employ, but is also a decision about whether it would be appropriate for the person who enters the teleporter to extend their prudential concern to the person who emerges to the other end, whether it would be reasonable to hold the resulting person morally and legally accountable for the other person's actions, and so forth. Consider again the dispute whether an early term fetus is a person. It seems that there is something more substantive at issue in this debate than simply whether we call such a being a person. One obvious suggestion is that the substantive matter at issue is that the substantive matter is at issue in this debate. Another typo. Is whether an early term fetus ought to be accorded the moral standing of a person, that is, whether it has a serious claim or right to life, which makes abortion seriously immoral, which turns into a debate about whether it's a person via the common assumption that all and only persons have a serious right to life. This brings us to a third way that the personal identity debate might be turn out to be more than merely semantic. As previously noted, the concept of personal identity is normally assigned a central quasi-theoretical role in structuring some important practical and ethical concerns. If there is a candidate that was uniquely intrinsically suited to be the reasonable object of person-directed practices, prudential concern, descriptions, moral and legal accountability, and the like, then this too might provide a substantive reason to favor that candidate over all the others. The answer to the question of personal identity might then be settled by the correct answer if there is one to certain ethical questions. For example, how earlier and later person stages need to be related to each other in order for it to be legitimate to hold later stages morally and or legally accountable for the actions of earlier stages. A consequence of this traditional approach is that it reverses the traditional way of thinking about the nature of the connection between questions of personal identity and ethical questions. It's commonly assumed that we settle the question of whether the early term fetus has a serious right to life by first settling the question of whether it's a person. It's also generally supposed that the answer to the question of whether it's legitimate to hold a person accountable for some past crime depends partly on whether they are the same person who committed the crime, where this question is supposed to be settled independently and antecedently of the question about responsibility. On the current suggestion, things go the other way around. Ethical considerations would partly decide the question of whether or not it's in the early term fetus of the person, perhaps by adjudicating whether it is a being that possesses properties that ground a claim to its possessing a serious right to life in virtue of possessing these properties. Ethical considerations become the arbiter of the question of personal identity rather than the other way around. This goes contrary to ordinary thought, which plausibly takes facts about personal identity to be independent justifiers, in Mark Johnson's phrase of ethical and legal questions. If this is rather than the point of personal identity, then at this point, the question of personal identity becomes a question for ethicists, not metaphysicians, and the question of personal identity become hostage to the outcome of certain substantial ethical debates. That maybe goes into here. And I have a paper on conventionalism and abortion for which I need to take this note. This, I think, is the first time we're going to see a scrivener on the stream. I have another set up in case I want to stream writing at some point. This is a Terra, not scrivener, but we'll see scrivener in a sec. I'm thinking about streaming writing also, where there's nothing to see because I'll just be silent and typing. There's nothing to hear because I'll be silent and typing. I'll probably be playing music though, because I often listen to music when I write. And that would be even more boring than the usual thing I do here, which is read papers and comment on them and put them in Hypernomicon. But since I do this mostly for myself, I don't see anything weird with doing the writing thing mostly for myself, and I think it might have some of the benefits that, why is Vivaldi opening up? Close. It might have some of the benefits that I get from doing this research on stream, which is that it really gets me to focus. You can't be distracted if, in principle, if not in practice, hypothetical people are watching you. Conclusion. The person identity debate seems to have reached an impasse. There seem to be two equally good blah 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 blah. Yeah, this was useless. Not to be mean to Carolyn West, she's great, but this didn't say anything. There's nothing in this book chapter. It's, I think, characteristic of many book chapters that maybe they need not have existed.